We'll talk more about that in just a minute, but I'm delighted to say it's now time for the paper review. Joining us this morning, barrister extraordinaire Andrew Eborn. Good morning.
Good morning, lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too.
Both of you.
A vision in blue this morning.
Well, I thought we'd sort of match and go somewhere, I thought.
If you call me a deck chair again.
Kind of.
Okay.
What about a rock stick?
It would be a bit of Brighton rock, absolutely.
Okay, let's move on, shall we? So, Andrew, we were just talking about this. Obviously, this terrible violence in France. Just the papers are full of it.
That's absolutely full of it for yet another day. And the boy's funeral, 17-year-old who was killed on Tuesday. Basically, his funeral was yesterday, and lots of people came out in force. There's been more rioting. It's the worst since 2005. You might remember there were the riots in Clichy-sous-Bois, which is just outside of Paris.
Did they not have a state of emergency then?
They did. They did. The whole thing went on for 21 days. And you have, looking at the pictures, some of these when they're looting shops and going into small businesses and so on and so forth, you have to say, what's that got to do with the murder of a particular boy?
How do you riot and make it relevant to a murder? This is their way of speaking. I'm not saying it's right.
They're venting.
But they're venting, and the testosterone is there. And yes, I'm sure now there is some opportunism as well. And they're these are very.
But taking Nikes and televisions, what's that got to do with that sort of highlighting an issue?
So I think the whole thing is a tinderbox, and it's been sitting there waiting to happen for a long time. This, I think, has pushed them over the edge, and this is how people are now taking to the streets and what they're doing. But just in terms of the numbers, I mean, the sheer numbers, the fifth night of violence, 2,800 arrests, but also not just, as I was saying, this has happened in Marseille, in Lyon, it has happened in Paris as well. So across France.
No, absolutely. And now Macron's deploying these special forces. Are going to be about 45,000 police officers are going to be going out. It's what they call the equivalent of the SAS over in France.
GIGN.
The GIGN. Yes, so with an appropriate sort of accent from something to do with the Pink Panther. But no, the reality is exactly that.
Thank you for that.
He's got to get it under control because it's going to be hitting the headlines. But you're right, it's a tinderbox. And I think when there's underlying unrest, this is what happens. The slightest thing can spark it. And I say the last time it happened, 21 days the whole thing went on, and the whole place was a nightmare. I'm supposed to be in France in a couple of days' time.
So that's really interesting. The Foreign Office are issuing advisories for people travelling to France, so you want to check the Foreign Office website. I mean, 700 businesses have been ransacked or burnt down since the police shooting of that young man. And obviously they've been making all of these arrests. Now, the big question for me is why? And there's a lot written this morning about anger at what they said was an endemic police racist issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the problem. It's that tinderbox. It's a little spark that will happen. We still haven't gotten to the bottom of what happened to the 17-year-old in his car. We've all seen the footage.
Yeah.
We still don't know, haven't heard the full side of the story. The handling of these things, I always say history repeats itself because we never learn the lessons from history.
100%.
And the sooner that people can get out and explain, this is what happened, this is the reason it happened, then you might be able to diffuse the situation.
This situation, I think, has actually, it's not just about police racism. For these young people who are experiencing racism in France in every single day as they live in their ghetto, have no opportunities. David, are poor, can't get employment. This has just typified for them that feeling that racism is making their lives a misery in every way.
But we're automatically saying it's racism, and we don't know yet is the short answer. I mean, because what happens is the media try and fill a hole. Whenever there's a hole, when there's a vacuum, we all sort of rush in and say it must have happened because of that.
I think we do know that in France there is a big problem with racism.
In several countries there are all sorts of issues and so on and so forth. We do not know the full details of that shooting other than what we've seen in the video.
No, of course
And I think that's the thing. What caused that shooting? What the police need to do is to get out and say, look, these are the circumstances.
Well, you see, so again, you're talking about the void. The fact is the police claimed the officer opened fire because the vehicle was driving towards them, as if to hit them. Now, clearly, that was not the case from the footage.
He was leaning on the bonnet now. He was leaning on the bonnet and the car moved forward.
Yeah, not on the video we've seen. I mean, and it's been exactly that. The police, if I remember rightly, he was at the side.
He was at the side
of the car, wasn't in front of it.
News agencies have confirmed shows an officer pointing a gun through the stationary car window.
Well, we saw it with our own eyes. I mean, that was the video that I saw. What they need to do is to come out and explain all of that.
Exactly.
Because if it looks as though from that they're not telling the truth, there's going to be bigger issues, and it goes into that sort of cover-up. But I think, and what happens is we then say, well, it's obviously racist. racism and things like that. You need to control the narrative.
But he hasn't controlled the narrative.
No.
He's been absent, hasn't he?
Yeah, and that's the problem.
And it's a major problem. And now, and I was reading this morning that violence has now engulfed French Guiana.
Yeah.
It is also in Martinique. It's also in the Indian Ocean island of Reunion.
Yeah.
These are all part of the French overseas territories.
And it will happen. And then, as I say, 21 days, the last big one in 2005. That's how long it took after a state of emergency was declared halfway through. But basically, we need to get that sort of sorted. The starting point has to be, let's get to the truth. What happened on Tuesday? What were the real circumstances? And make sure that it's together with the video evidence supports that. Because if you don't do that, there'll be an issue.
But then we have to look at why these young men are so unhappy and so disillusioned that they find any opportunities, you say, to run off with a Nike TV, Nike pair of trainers or a TV. You know, what is driving them? What's underpinning this? Because that is where the answer lies.
Yeah, but I have to say, it's the point I made at the beginning, I don't think all of them are rioting because of the stuff. Sometimes you get mobs in there and they talk about rival gangs.
Agreed. And we know that. The minute there's some sort of disorder, then other groups pile in.
Absolutely.
And then they want to cause anarchy. We know that happens. But also, I mean, I was just very taken by some of the accounts. This gentleman who's 43 said this country is in chaos. I've never seen this. He owns a tobacconist that was looted. And he goes on to say everything that we have, Macron must act because we can't last. I'm leaving the country. And the question I have for you is France the first of many countries? Is it the only country? Does it stand alone?
I think at the moment, whenever there are crises in terms of economy, which there is on a global scale, it basically builds up this sort of underlying discontent. And that what happened, all the prejudices that people have about what are the causes for this, why don't they have a job because somebody else has come and taken it, all that sort of prejudice, which could be unfounded, is going to spark all this sort of discrimination and so on and so forth. So I think you're right. You've got a tinderbox around the world.
And of course,
people look at that sort of stuff.
France changed its laws a few years back that policemen were allowed to use their firearm even if their life were not at risk. So that is, you know, that adds into the mix because we've never had, well, we had Mark Duggan, didn't we? That shooting a few years back. But this doesn't really happen in other countries very much. But it does happen in France more than it does the rest of Europe.
I think leaders around the world need to be watching this very carefully.
Absolutely.
And just to take note of what is going on.
I think so, David.
And I think that's the take-home message for me. And I felt very uneasy last night about where we're going and the sort of deafness that I hear from politicians who really don't think there's a problem.
And I think you're absolutely, it's what we said beforehand, it does happen. You get sparks for all sorts of things. How do you then control that? How do you take the issue out? What's the fundamental point? Because it's not just this one shooting. There's all sorts of things that could spark it off again.
Absolutely.
And so you need to address that, look at the underlying concern and make sure something happens.
But then how
about
do you
it.
start addressing this now? You have ghettos, you know, like this everywhere.
So I used to work in Nanterre, so I know that area very well, and it's very, very diverse and it's very poor.
Yes. And how do you suddenly integrate these people into society? What do you do? Social engineering? You're going to live here and you're going to live there? You know, it's very difficult.
Well, it's jaw, not war. Talk to the different people, talk to the communities and say, look, OK, we recognise there's an issue. How can we address the issue? It's only by getting people round and trying to address that you can do it. But I think you're right. I think what happens is an incident will spark a much, much bigger thing, and that's what's happening.
I think so too. Let's move on to Rwanda, and I'm really keen to know your thoughts on this, because obviously the High Court ruled that the Rwanda plan was legal. Now we've had the Court of Appeal ruling by 2-1 against the Lord Chief Justice.
Yes, he was the dissenting voice.
He was the dissenting voice, but he's the most senior judge on that panel.
Also not saying that the Rwanda law was illegal, saying that it wasn't clear enough further down the line what can happen to these people.
Yeah, there was a risk, basically, that Rwanda might send them back to the country, and they've got a history of this, is what
which Rwanda refutes.
Which Rwanda refutes.
But we should have surely predicted this and written it into our law.
Well, and you also have to ask why this is happening, because in a way it was sort of predictable. It's one of Rishi's big pledges, stop the boats and so on and so forth. One of 5, remember those 5 a day?
They're stuck behind
5 a day stuck behind them, none of which are working, stop.
None of which?
Well, no, but he will get inflation below, because that's an easy one. But
it's not looking that easy.
I'm not sure it's to do with him, though, but anyway.
I know, but that's the other thing. The point is this: Rwanda, since the very beginning, has been like a bad word, hasn't it? It's been cursed on that sort of basis, whether it's costing £170,000 per person, which was the earlier story, to the sort of scheme costing 1.5 billion of your money going to people who are basically foiled. They're being supported in that sort of way. What's happening is that in a way it sort of plays into their hands. They say, look, well, we tried to stop it, but we're being stopped by lawyers. The reality is it will go to the Supreme Court, and then it could go off to the European Court. It's not...
Are
you're
you
not
kidding?
No, absolutely.
Are you seriously kidding?
Absolutely. I can guarantee... And what I will also guarantee...
Hang on a minute. Wait. I thought the Supreme Court was the end of the matter.
It could keep going. No, it could keep going. So I guarantee no flights will be taking off to Rwanda and then before a general election.
This decade.
No, it will go on forever. So this... You heard it here first.
But just tell me...
exactly what's going to happen.
I don't understand. So the British people believe in British judiciary. Yep. So therefore, we've got 3 courts. How many more do you need?
Keep going.
Well, you need the one that gives you the answer you want when you're the people suing the government.
Yeah.
That's the answer.
January 2025...
people will have dropped their cornflakes over this.
No, they would have. And absolutely right. So that's what's going to happen. But it was also, just to be clear, it was never, ever intended really to send people to Rwanda. It was supposed to be a deterrent to say, this is what's going to happen. And it plays into all sorts of narratives. Lawyers, as always, are dictating how this is going to happen. It's going to keep going. People on both sides are going to have that big argument. But it won't happen overnight. And I can guarantee it's not going to be sorted by the election.
What this is doing, David, is it is deflecting rather nicely from the message that most of our immigration comes in through the front door.
Correct. Not from the back door.
Not the back door.
No.
This is possibly 80,000 people this year, but actually it's going to be 1 million.
It is 1 million.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And so also, why did we give Rwanda £140 million if we haven't actually sorted out the back end and how it might possibly work? I mean, that just seems completely nuts to me. Rishi Sunak, I mean, he's not having a great week, is
it? It hasn't been good for Rishi, has it?
Not really.
Good at all.
I mean, it is extraordinary, and that's why I'm asking that question this morning about Nadine Dorries. If she is going to lose a 24,000 majority, I mean, that would normally be considered incredibly safe seat. I mean, what on earth the Conservatives are facing? So the question this morning is Sunak sunk? 0344 499 1000. Text the word talk and your message to 87222 and tweet us at Talk TV. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's all right. I know. Well, I think a very easy answer to that is his sunk. But also, what's extraordinary, I think most people are now planning for not this election because they're assuming they've lost it. They're planning for what's going to happen next.
So what I find really fascinating about this, when you talk to the pollsters, and yes, Labour has a commanding and convincing lead, particularly in the red wall. Yeah. But people are voting not because they are positively voting for a particular party. They're voting against the other party.
Isn't that awful?
What a terrible state of affairs.
Terrible state of affairs. But what's happening, you're getting these, I don't want to use unprecedented use of the word unprecedented, but you're getting these situations where people are leaving, there's Zach Goldsmith, and you're writing the most horrible damning letter as you're going out the door. And what's happening, you have to say, well, what are the reasons for this? And I think the reasons, obviously, they're not planning for this election because they're all assuming they've lost it, but maybe there's a power struggle ready for the one after this, when there might be the reintroduction of Boris.
There's another thing. All the backbench MPs are looking at their majorities and wondering what on earth they're going to do.
80-seat majority. Come on, the biggest since Maggie Thatcher.
So you know the problem with that 80-seat majority was that although he had an 80-seat majority, most of his party were Ramonas. So even his 80-seat majority couldn't help him.
Well, and also, obviously, I would say this, wouldn't I? But the Brexit Party stood down because they believed Boris Johnson would deliver a full, fat Brexit. That is not what happened. No. We know that didn't happen. And I will say this, but if you look at other parties, Reform UK or any other party that actually believes in that sovereignty, they're polling really well. So Reform UK now at 10%. That's never happened.
And the polls nowadays, probably for about the last 10 years, have never reflected what actually happens at the ballot box, because we have this really polarised society where if you have a view that does not fit with the generalised narrative, you get shouted at. So you say nothing, and when a pollster comes around, you go, oh yeah, I'm going to vote for Labour.
And it's absolutely right.
And you go to the ballot box where you're behind your curtain.
It's exactly what happens. You ask somebody an unfavourable view, they're going to lie to the pollster to avoid the humiliation, which is why the pollsters have got it wrong on so many different fronts. But they can say whatever
they want inside that ballot box.
And of course, and they do. And they're working on that sort of basis. But it's gone from an oven-ready deal to a coven-ready, because it's a witch hunt everywhere, is what they're saying. So have a look at that.
Well
sort of I think we're here all day.
You're very good at this. Yeah, very good. Should we talk about asbestos in schools?
Story.
A very bad story. We've seen cases of mesothelioma. Have you seen that yourself? Yeah, it's awful. Yeah. And actually, there's a lot of asbestos lying around in old buildings, particularly in schools.
Yeah, this is a campaign by the Sunday Times, and good for them to bring this up. 10,000 killed by asbestos in the schools. And they're saying that the sad thing is that there's still a lot, about 21,500 schools still contain asbestos. And so their campaign is, let's get this sorted.
Although I thought asbestos wasn't a problem unless it was being moved.
I was about to say exactly the same. We know that asbestos is fine unless you move it. And the reason is that you get these... Asbestos is made... There are 3 types of asbestos, aren't there? And you get needle-shaped crystals. That's why you get the inflammation and mesothelioma in the lung disease. So as long as you don't move it... Now, I happen to live on a rural property, and I've got asbestos lying around. And again, they've said to me, if you move it, you have to have specialist people to move it, and they have to wear breathing apparatus and everything.
Leave it alone.
But leave it. I mean, it's on the floor. I realised I was walking on it the other day, which probably wasn't the best thing to do. But should we get it out of schools, or do we leave it? The worry is people drilling into it.
Yes.
That's the concern.
They say it's a hidden time. First of all, like all these stories, you need to get to the actual facts. So as you say, if it's only an issue if you move it, well, what does moving it mean? If you want to drill, because here's the picture of the new headmaster or headmistress, that's going to be an issue.
You absolutely can't. But then asbestos wouldn't really be in the walls. It should be only in the ceiling, I think. And pipes.
But does this not come back to infrastructure again?
Of course it does.
That our schools are falling apart. They need investment. We don't have the money for investment. We don't have enough school places. You know, so this is what this comes back to again. I'm going to give you an interesting fact. I don't know if you know this. I have a patient who is a lawyer representing a class action for people with mesothelioma from talcum powder.
From talcum powder?
So that's really interesting. The story we didn't cover this morning was about aspartame and diet drinks and so on, and of course the classification as to whether it could be cancerous, and falling into that is talcum powder, and I read that this morning actually.
Mesothelioma.
That's interesting.
I've heard that before. How far down the road is it?
I don't know. I didn't quiz around you. You would have done.
I would have done. I would have quizzed. I would have pinned them down.
I only had 10 minutes.
Okay, enough of your private practice for the moment. Shall we move on?
Yes.
Where do you want to go next?
Well, we can talk about pylons to be forced on public to hit net zero
I think we
goal.
should. I think we should, because I think this is a massive issue. I don't think they've really understood this. So the bottom line is that we need more energy. We all know it, because they're pushing electric cars. We can't generate enough electricity, and even if we can't actually attach it to the national grid.
You're absolutely right. And we talked about Rowan Atkinson and his disappointment in electric cars fairly recently, because
he's a very angry man, generally.
No, he's a lovely man. I've worked with him on all sorts of interesting things.
Of course you have.
I know, but it's all good stuff. But he is a big car. He's a big petrol head. Well, not petrol, electric head. Yeah, totally. And it worked on that sort of premise. The trouble is there's not enough power around at the moment, so they're dropping in, or they're talking about dropping in these pylons to make sure you get this. And the wonderful green belt, and I know you've got issues in your place where they secretly do it in the middle of the night.
Yes.
That's exactly what happened.
Well, so do they want to win the election? Because that is one way to actually turn the whole of the countryside against whichever political party does it.
So my reaction to you this morning over this was, we'll start looking like a third world country, but actually not quite, because I noticed when I was in Greece this summer that when I looked out of my balcony, my beautiful view, it was crisscrossed with wires just going everywhere on pylons.
So the story I told you this morning, and I'll share it now, it's in Spain. Yes. And so there's a beautiful valley. It's an area of natural beauty, and you're not allowed to put anything there. And then one night, 8 helicopters came in, each carrying a pylon, dropped it through the nature reserve, and then they laced the thing. By the time you're there, I went stomping up to the town hall, and by the time they'd actually done that, you couldn't appeal. No,
it's absolutely scandalous. And some of them, though, you can make them look quite pretty. You can make them look like trees. No, but you make them look like trees. So if you look at it and the very clever ways of doing it, you can hide it.
But it's money.
I don't know, everything's going to cost money. But the reality is, it's a nightmare. You need to, with electric cars, and we touched on this last time when we spoke about it, you need to look at dynamic charging. So when you're going along, it will charge it on that sort of basis.
Or we don't try and force a policy on the world before we have the infrastructure to cope with
But you see, when it goes back to my childhood, and I said as a 10-year-old, let's build more nuclear power stations. It seemed like a really clever thing to do. I did, because I was obsessed with Sizewell A, and then latterly Sizewell B.
15 years ago, you were saying you was a 10-year-old. Is that right?
But the thing is, if a child can come up with those kind of policies, and the reason I like nuclear is because, of course, it is environmentally friendly if you can actually work out what to do with the waste, but that's another.
And you had to get rid of the scare thing. I mean, that's the problem.
Right.
And you always find it's politically motivated, the way that these headlines work, isn't it?
It is.
You work on that sort of basis. So nuclear power, everybody's going to say, it's going to explode, it's going to be a nightmare, work on that sort of basis.
3 Mile Island.
What we need to do, absolutely, and what I love about this show, it's always we shine more light and less heat. And I think that's the thing. Let's get the facts, put it in front of people, and they will decide. This is expensive. Putting pylons down is ugly. It was going to destroy the landscape.
It is, but more importantly, I think, there is a question over the health benefits benefits or not of living near or under a pylon.
Now, I don't know enough about that, but I know there are all sorts of spurious cases about whether pylons cause all sorts of issues, for example, leukemia, lymphomas, things like that. I don't know. I don't know if the evidence exists. They do hum, but then they're at high voltage.
So do you on a Friday?
But I've seen it. They're at high voltage, and that's why, because that way you can travel great distances.
But again, it's one of these things that plays into the myth and fear. It's Edward Bernays, the father of PR, who said the way you sell anything is through fear, the biggest human emotion.
We've
need
seen
to do
that over
this.
the last 3 years.
Exactly. So we're drowning in a sea of information, most of which is false. What we need to do is stick to the facts and say, OK, people have said this, but people said it's rubbish. So what we need to look at is, look, these are the facts. This is what we need to power this net to zero. This is how much it's going to cost. Do you want it?
Yes.
And if the answer is a resounding no, there's your answer.
Why don't we have a referendum on net zero?
Who's been saying that?
Have another one and take it to the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court and the
European Court of Human Rights, and then someone else.
And the lawyers will be happy.
You'll be happy.
I'm always happy.
Andrew, such a pleasure. Andrew Eborn, barrister extraordinaire. He's always happy, you know, by the way. Right, time for a break. After the break, it's your turn. Your calls, your thoughts and your messages. This is Talk TV.